My article concerns the problem of various forms of patriotism we can come across in the Western civilization. The main question is, which form of patriotism agrees more with the modern pluralistic and multicultural world? I present two main types of patriotic spirit we deal with today. The first type is the somewhat old-fashioned ethnic patriotism, which is usually based on common cultural and historical grounds of one particular nation. I think that only two nations really proposed some kind of universal patriotism that consists in universal virtues that can be adopted and praised by any human being. The first example is France, the so-called Les Vertus Républicaines, and the second is USA, American Creed, so-called American Creed. Those nations seem to have found a key to today's problems of assimilation and migration. According to the ancient Chinese strategist and philosopher Sun Tzu, one of the key elements of one nation's prosperity is the moral connection between the ruler and the people. We can still learn something from this author because China's experience of centralist government and nationalistic ideas is far longer than Western one. In China, the Confucian ideology helped to form a new elite of officials independent from feudal lords, so that during the rule of the Tang dynasty, China was a country with about 50 million inhabitants administered by about 1 million officials. China was the first society based on knowledge, although in 18th and 19th century some of that knowledge was pretty much outdated. Today the problem of moral connection comes back in our societies as a problem of national and cultural identification. From 2-3 decades, elites of the West are worried with the demographic crisis that endangers both the accumulated power of the West and the institution of liberal democracy. Although the West is not the only region in the world with a small birth rate, because demographic growth tends to be smaller and smaller worldwide, but only the West, Russia included, and Japan have the biggest demographic problems. There are many theories that try to explain this phenomenon. Apart from moralistic conservative grumbles, there are economical theories that point out the conflict between big traditional family and urbanization. Everywhere where townsmen are more numerous than villagers, we can observe lower birth rate. Closest to success in reversing this tendency were two Western countries with well-established welfare and social traditions, that is France and Sweden. But even in those countries the goal was not achieved and the situation was not reversed. In this situation everything depends on the immigrants from the poor south of the globe. Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman was of an opinion that Europe needs 30 million additional immigrants in 3 decades to rescue the European civilization from falling apart. Not all appeals are so dramatic in form, but already today we can observe a very interesting competition between the Western democracies in attracting immigrants from poorer regions of the globe. No longer is the immigration a matter of allowing random persons with post-colonial passports to live in Europe, like it used to be several decades ago, but it's a game of talents and virtues. The political elites have to choose the best human resources for Europe, its economy and social institutions. The key words are integration and assimilation. After several decades of experience, the West have already decided which people from which culture are manageable or troublesome. The Muslims are in general often considered as the most troublesome, mainly because of the difference between authoritarian and religiously motivated political conditions in their countries and the Western liberal democracies. More liked are the Chinese, who sometimes are considered to be better co-workers and workers than the Westerners. The Chinese communities are very often described as sleeping minorities, that is, not so culturally visible, although they rarely really assimilate with the Western societies. Already in 19th centuries, when thousands of Chinese used to immigrate to the USA and Australia to work at the railroads and or in mines, they used to say, "Look into a mirror," to those who are trying to assimilate. That was to mean that already the race itself defined a person culturally as a Chinese or Westerner. Also today, assimilation of the Chinese person in the Western country can have various phases. Let us use the example of Natasha Chang, a writer from New York, and other Chinese-American writer Ami Chua. Whether Natasha Chang, born 1965, says that she never really perceived herself as a Chinese and wanted to escape from her race by befriending more Italian and Irish Americans than Asian Americans. The Ami Chua's attitude was completely different. The parents of Natasha Chang were proud of their Chinese heritage, but she was more proud that their parents spoke English fluently. Natasha was also mistrustful about white men interested in her culture, because she suspected them to be looking for some conservative and submissive Asian girls. On the other hand, Ami Chua, the aforementioned another writer of Chinese descent in America, is visibly proud of her Chinese heritage, especially those concerning the traditional, that is very harsh and serious, kind of method of upbringing of children. Other favorite immigrants in Europe and America are people from India. Their highly individual belief systems form far smaller danger of some unpleasant cultural clash with the Western culture than the belief system of the Muslims. In Farid Zakaria's opinion, a Hindu is pleased already with one religious statue in his home and has nothing against arrangements typical for secular states in public sphere. All this makes an assimilation of Indians in the West relatively easy and painless. Because of the Hindus in Great Britain, American author Walter Lacker predicts less problems with assimilation and immigrants in the future in the UK than in the continental part of Europe. Lacker is one of the authors convinced that the possibility of Islamization of Europe is real, although, for instance, Farid Zakaria quotes research results of the Pew Research Center and of the CIA that estimate the percentage of Muslims in Europe to be never higher than 9% of the whole population of Europe. Nevertheless, the British government perceives the Indian minority as a possibility and not as a threat, and even helps those Jews, so-called Jews of the East, financially. Also in America, very well-educated Hindus are treated with very much respect. There are many kinds of immigrants also within a particular cultural minority, but that's why so much depends on the idea how to assimilate them and how to integrate them with the Western society. The governments of various Western countries criticize each other's ideas and methods. We can distinguish two main methods of assimilation, the purely liberal one and the purely multicultural one. Some authors like Samuel Huntington try to find a middle way without much success. Huntington is widely criticized for his unbelief in the possibility of some constructive intercultural dialogue. The liberal model of assimilation was created when the idea of liberalism was, that is, in the 17th century Europe, which were torn by religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. The liberal example was set by Royal Society, a fellowship that deliberately concentrated on secular business to facilitate the dialogue between people of different religious and philosophic beliefs. The same idea is reflected in the Freemasonry in the Anderson's Constitution from the 1723. We can read that Freemasonry that quote, Freemasonry is in the method of uniting people who in normal circumstances were unable to socialize with each other, end quote. Many of the founders of Freemasonry were religious dissentients or refugees from religiously intolerant parts of the continent. So religious toleration was one of the key words for the first British liberals. It is no wonder that in this period the main idea of religious toleration by John Locke was formed. The giants of the French Enlightenment, like Montesquieu and Voltaire, were inspired by both Dutch and English liberals and Locke's idea of a private sphere, and they adapted it to French conditions. According to Pierre Manon, Montesquieu was the true inventor of liberalism because he has liberated the language of liberalism from absolute categories and clearly stated that liberty can be measured, and the best way to secure liberal private sphere is to establish two competing powers, legislature and executive. He perceived freedom as a state of things and not merely a philosophic idea. He also did not ask for the legitimization of political power as much as its function. The influence of Montesquieu and the spirit of Royal Society fellowship we can perceive in the ideology of the United States in times of Washington and Jefferson. The strict division between the secular public sphere and personal beliefs is visible in the treaty that USA signed with Tripolitania in 1796, where we can find a sentence describing USA as a country not based on any Christian values or any religious values, which meant that the Americans will not act like medieval crusaders in relation to Muslims. The same liberal spirit we can find a famous sentence by Primero Secretario de Estado of the first minister of the Prime Minister of Spain, José Moninho, Count of Floridablanca, who in 1766 recommended to quote, talk with the Moroccans in the same manner as to Italians or the British, end quote. This meant the real end of the era of crusaders and crusades, and aggressive Christian policy towards the rest of the world. Religion lost some of its meaning and the rights of an individual became more important. Atheist and secular author Richard Dawkins speculated on the possible effect that the treaty with Tripolitania could cause in today's US Congress, so much dominated by religious or quasi-religious rhetoric, if this treaty was to be read in the United States Congress of today. The freedom from religion proved to be also beneficial to religion itself. For instance, in the state, religious cults are doing far better than the political Anglican cult in Britain. Liberal model of integration is based on merit of an individual and the separation of public and private spheres. Second model of integration I'd like to talk about can be called multicultural or postmodern. Postmodernism is hard to define because of its deconstructive character, and so it can be seen more like an illness to a liberal or wider progressive discourse than a separate ideology or philosophy. Left and right-wing postmodernists criticize all universal narratives like liberalism, socialism or Christian democratism, forcing the right-wing politicians in some country like a Dutch conservative Frits Bolkestein to defend the legacy of Spinoza and Voltaire from attacks of multicultural left. Some left-wingers, disappointed with multiculturalism, joined the ex-conservatives, as Ian Buruma noticed, for instance. This postmodern political scene can be perceived as something exotic even to Germans. In Germany, when it's the center and the moderate left who defend the legacy of Enlightenment. For instance, Jürgen Habermas who highlights the importance of enlightened public opinion in forming of more humanitarian and egalitarian society, although the Enlightenment project is far from being completed, accused postmodernism and postmodernists of promoting old-style conservatism with just a new label. Postmodernists usually don't accept liberal universal claim to knowledge about the source of human happiness, and in the clash between the individual and the culture usually support the culture. The struggle between liberals and postmodernists in today's world have a huge impact on global politics. The front line is not always so much visible. Some postmoderns are lost in their own contradictions. Sometimes liberals confuse liberalism with permissivism and accept even radical Islamic groups, for instance, as lawful members of liberal society. This blind openness on other culture instead of an individual is sometimes criticized by more typical liberals like American neurologist Sam Harris. The same problem we see in connection to the Western softness on China and the breaches of human rights in that country. For a liberal, like a French writer Guy Sorman, every postmodern tale about so-called Asian values and so on, it's a set of authoritarian rules that reportedly suit those Asian values. That is a set of authoritarian rules that reportedly suit the Chinese better than a liberal democracy. By the way, Taiwan can prove how ridiculous this idea is, because we have a liberal democracy there, so it's perfect for the Chinese also. Also for the Chinese, it's just so this, according to Guy Sorman and liberals like him, Asian values is just an excuse for Western government to do nothing for oppressed opposition in China. The same way of thinking presents the last British governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten. The choice of assimilation policy depends on how relevant is the presence of liberal elements in the concept of a nation's patriotism. We can see that in some nations patriotism consists in belief in some universal ideas like freedom, whereas in other is more based on history, race, tradition, culture, etc. On one hand, we can quote Victor Hugo, who was dreaming about rejection of patriotism as a form of stupid egoism, which could allow people not to be French or British anymore, but simply people. On the other hand, we have Joseph de Maistre, a French conservative of Savoyan descent, who is well known for his statement that about encountering many many Frenchmen, Italians, and Russians in his life, but no people whatsoever. End quote. So we can see that this competition between universal and national values is nothing new. The difference between a conservative and a postmodernist is that a traditional conservative openly perceives a local tradition and culture to be superior to other culture. Postmodernists sometimes pick and choose a culture which they want to represent, sometimes praising them out of proportions. Like American author Gerald McMaster, who constructed a little bit ridiculous thesis that the founding fathers were ideologically more influenced by Native Americans and their concept of life and world than by the authors of European Enlightenment. The total lack of sources makes it impossible to prove this theory. Conservatives in the USA, as we can see, are the opposite on the opposite side of the front line than postmodernists sometimes, but this situation is not typical in the West. USA, United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Germany, all those countries have great liberal traditions. although it took several decades longer for the Germans to adopt them. But those traditions can be more or less visible in the model of local patriotism. When USA during the 19th century turned from a land of wasps into a melting pot, the new form of patriotism was created, which is less based on cultural heritage and more of universal values like freedom, personal dignity, respect for privacy, etc. One of the great admirers of American model of patriotism is French economist Guy Sorman, who claims that USA was a kind of European Union before Europeans thought about the Union on a continental scale. According to Sorman, the new type of patriotism includes everybody who is willing to become an American patriot and excludes nobody. And this patriotism, according to Sorman, is the most important reason why almost all Earthlings would happily immigrate to USA. Even a conservative, Samuel Huntington, highlights the so-called American creed as a very attractive set of values which are both American and liberal, that is, universal. That's why even Muslims in the US tend to identify themselves as Americans, and even when they are criticizing wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, they do it in the first and foremost because they resent endangering USA and the friendship between Americans of different faith, not or decent, not because they support Hussein or Osama, or perceive all Western intervention as crusades. Integration of Muslims in the USA is promising. Of course, the average better level of education of American Muslims than among European Muslims definitely helps. And this integration of Asians and Hispanics is even more promising in the United States. They very rarely close themselves in ghettos, and a huge part of them marry white Protestants, Catholics, and non-believers. Although Muslims have and the British ruled together over India for decades, today the assimilation of Muslim immigrants in Britain isn't a very smooth one. In her book Londonistan, Melanie Phillips criticized both the British government, unable to deal with Islamic radicals in the United Kingdom, and the postmodernistic educators who usually encourage to bring up children according to the rules of their parents' culture, in spite of liberal individualistic values and the rights of man. The young immigrant is in effect cut from the liberal society, and the cultural ghettos are being formed, like in Bedford. Phillips complains that there are no British versions of American creed, a set of universal values the young Muslims or Hindus could identify with. The model of British patriot and the model of British liberal are totally different things. British patriotism is based more on blood history, the crown, several events, battles, and the memories, etc., much more than on liberal virtues. Melanie Phillips is worried that the British resigned from forming any British creed after the disappointment of the years 1945 and 1952, the Egyptian Canal and so on, and blamed this negligence as cause of the Muslim hatred towards British government. Melanie Phillips blames also British growing religious indifference, but only in context of the total lack of British exceptionalism. Both immigrants and the British who live in the UK for decades could identify with. Britain is the most eager to give way to Muslim claims as far as Sharia law, for instance, is concerned. Several regions in England exert this role. Some other countries also try to appease more depending Muslims, like the government of Geneva, that was convinced by the Swiss Muslim author Tariq Ramadan to ban a classic drama about Muhammad by Voltaire, from the stage as politically incorrect and insulting to Muslims or something, which is a perfect example of a visible conflict between Islamic theocratic claim and the Western concept of freedom of speech, the liberal Western concept of freedom of speech. Multiculturalists from London tend to criticize France for an, quote, illiberal, end quote, politics towards Muslim minority. For instance, for a prohibition of wearing burqas in the schools. Although it's the French policy liberal, not the British one. The French policy is focused on respect towards individuals and the neutrality of public sphere, not on privileges of some more or less pushy cultural groups. The consistent policy, although not perfect, is more this consistent French policy, although not perfect, is more effective. Even Walter Laqueur, by no means a friend of French politics, admits that the more laïc approach of the French provokes maybe more incidents with radical Muslims, but also creates much bigger areas of French secularized Muslim community. Paradoxically, also the respect towards the French state is in French Muslim communities more visible than in British Muslim communities in UK towards the British government. France emits the clear message, whereas UK is inconsistent in her approach. France also elaborated her own version of American creed, which is the republican virtues or values, les valeurs républicaines, la vertu républicaine, based on universal liberal values of Voltaire and Montesquieu, social solidarity, and the republican values of Rousseau that forms some visible cultural consensus, within which the division between the public and private sphere is one of the key elements. From the starting point, we can see how the French authors like Jean-Claude Guilbeault defend what's left from political idealism against the political cynicism and multicultural experiments. An immigrant in France, this country has a long tradition of first-rate French citizen of foreign descent like René Goscinny or Danny Boone, gets a clear message about the rules he must obey in order to become a good citizen and to be treated like one. And his heritage has relatively little to do with this. Of course, USA as a first melting pot in modern history beats even France in the art of producing new good citizens. According to Indian-American Fareed Zakaria, USA is the French universal nation in history, whereas Europe seems still incapable of assimilating culturally new elements. Perhaps in the future, the United Europe, based on similar values to American creed or republican virtues, will compete with the USA. Although today some authors try to make a list of European values which are similar but not identical to American ones, sometimes even stand in opposition to one or two of the American list of American values. Polish liberal author Wojciech Sadurski is very fond of Habermas's idea of constitutional patriotism that would be based on the institutions of the United European Union, which would be parallel to historic local patriotisms, not an enemy of this local patriotism, but parallel to those. In Sadurski's opinion, typically European values are tendency to trust the government more than private investors, solidarity which contrasts with the American myth of a self-made man and American Puritan entrepreneurial spirit. Sadurski also presents several examples in which Americans try to undermine those new European values or criticize them. which is visible in one of the pro-American newspapers in Poland. That is the tabloid, one of the most popular tabloid in Poland, the Wprost. And journalists from Wprost wrote several times about 400,000 of European Union officials, although the real number is 30,000, more than 10 times smaller. And just to prove how Europe is deprived of freedom on the American way and so on. So we can see the type of American propaganda and some clash between the European and American values. All this does not mean that Sadurski is an enemy to everything American. On the contrary, he thinks that some aspects of society are better regulated in USA, but for our considerations here, more important is the question if the European values can evolve and popularize fast enough to help Europe assimilate a large group of African and ancient immigrants in the nearest future. A Dutch politician of Somali descent, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has found an asylum in the Netherlands, moved recently to USA, where the new asylum was offered to her. A new citizenship was offered to her because the Dutch authorities expulsed him from the country when they found out about some inaccuracies in her original application for asylum in the Netherlands. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has become a controversial figure in the Netherlands because of her sharp criticism of radical Islam and Islam in general as a religion basically hostile to women and their needs. Already in the USA in April 2013, she appeared on Farid Zakaria's show on CNN channel. During the interview, she described Dutch elites as totally possessed with postmodern political correctness and criticized them for treating Dutch Muslims like naughty but cute kids, instead of demanding some responsibility from their part. In Ayaan Hirsi Ali's opinion, the Dutch authorities tended to look the other way each time when Muslims committed some crime or misdemeanor. She stated that it only makes assimilation harder. The fact that European liberal values are sometimes defended by the right-wing populists like Geert Wilders, for instance, in the Netherlands, who criticize not only Muslim but also Polish immigrants who reportedly steal their jobs and so on, but by no means endangered enlightenment values. And this fact that those populists are defending the Enlightenment makes it even easier for postmodernists to criticize liberal means and methods. Sometimes liberals are confused, seeing on one side chauvinistic defenders of European values and postmodern politicians on the other side. For instance, Angela Merkel, who, although her function as a boss of Christian Democratic Party, manifests very often their attachment to liberal values, both social and economical, is not sure how far should she support the American crusade against terrorism, for instance, which is based not only on liberal values and defense of those values, but also of radical Protestantism of American heartland, which she finds repulsive. On October the 10th, 2010, Merkel announced the total fiasco of multiculturalism and criticized German Turks for their poor professional qualifications. Walter Laqueur observes that in Germany the biggest problem is the language barrier that makes it impossible for many students to finish their schools. According to American author George Friedman, a severe critic of multiculturalism, who was glad with Merkel's speech, the very idea of multiculturalism is not a serious social project, but an example of wishful thinking, an incoherent concept of bribing the immigrants so that with social security and so on, and some privileges, so that they stay outside the core of the society of some particular Western nation, in Germany in this case. Maybe this opinion is somewhat simplified, but we cannot exclude the possibility that some of the multiculturalists were not working to construct new ghettos, but seriously wanted to solve social problems. But the fact remains: multiculturalism does not work. Also, Poland is in danger of multicultural irresponsible project, because liberal values are very poorly rooted in our society. Poles are a conservative nation who for instance, supported the furious Islamists and not the Danish caricaturists, as we can remember. We can only hope for some liberalization before a bigger number of immigrants arrive to Poland in the nearest future.